For thousands of years, being left-handed was treated as something wrong. Children were punished for writing with their left hand. Priests once claimed it was a sign of the devil. Entire languages built the word for left into their vocabulary for everything sinister, clumsy, and cursed. And yet, no matter how hard societies tried to stamp it out, roughly 1 in every 10 humans on the planet has continued to be born left-handed, generation after generation, for as long as anyone has been keeping records. For decades, scientists could not explain why. It seemed to break every rule evolution was supposed to follow. If being left-handed made someone even slightly less fit to survive in a right-handed world, natural selection should have wiped it out thousands of years ago. Instead, it persisted, stubbornly, at almost exactly the same rate across nearly every culture, every continent, and every era of recorded history. Then, starting a little over a decade ago, genetics finally began to catch up with this mystery. And what scientists found inside human DNA did not just explain why left-handedness exists. It revealed something about how the human brain itself is built, something so fundamental that it changes how we think about the difference between the left-handed and right-handed brain entirely. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what is happening inside the DNA of a left-handed person, why this trait has survived every attempt to breed it out of the population, and why scientists now believe left-handed people may process the world in a way that is genuinely, measurably different. Here is what we are covering today. First, the specific genes scientists have identified that shape whether a person is born left-handed. Second, the ancient evolutionary theories that explain why this trait never disappeared, despite thousands of years of bias against it. And third, the surprising connection between left-handedness and how the two halves of the human brain communicate with each other, a connection that some researchers believe explains everything from creativity to certain neurological conditions. If you are left-handed, or if someone in your family is, stick around until the end, because there is a detail about this research that even a lot of scientists did not expect, and it says something about how varied the human brain really is. Let's start with the numbers, because they are strange in their own right. Roughly 10% of the global population is left-handed. That number has held remarkably steady across recorded history. Cave paintings created tens of thousands of years ago, based on the angle of handprints and tool marks, suggest a similar ratio existed even among some of the earliest humans. Skeletal remains, showing which arm bones were more heavily used over a lifetime, point to the same pattern going back tens of thousands of years. This is not a modern phenomenon. It is ancient, embedded deep in human history, long before anyone was writing books calling it a curse. For a long time, scientists assumed handedness might simply come down to environment, whether a child was encouraged to use one hand over the other or copied a parent's habits. But twin studies eventually put that idea to rest. When researchers compared identical twins who share essentially all of their DNA against fraternal twins who share only about half, they found identical twins were significantly more likely to share the same handedness than fraternal twins, even when they were raised in identical households. The gap between identical and fraternal twins is one of the clearest signals in all of genetics that a trait has a real biological inherited component, and handedness showed that signal clearly. But knowing a trait is inherited is very different from knowing exactly which genes are responsible. For decades, scientists could see the genetic signal in twin studies, but they could not pinpoint where in the 3 billion letters of human DNA it was actually coming from. That finally started to change with the arrival of a research tool that transformed almost every field of human genetics, the Genome-Wide Association Study, or GWAS, which allows scientists to scan the entire genetic code of hundreds of thousands of people at once, searching for tiny genetic differences that show up more often in people who share a specific trait. In 2019, one of the largest studies of its kind was published in the journal Brain, led by researchers at the University of Oxford, analyzing genetic data from nearly 400,000 people through the UK Biobank, one of the largest medical research databases in the world. The results identified 4 specific regions of the human genome linked to left-handedness, and 3 of those 4 regions turned out to involve genes that build proteins responsible for something remarkable: the physical structure of the brain's cytoskeleton, the internal scaffolding inside brain cells that helps determine their shape and how they connect to each other. This was the moment the mystery started to make sense. These genes were not just some random genetic switch flipped one way or another. They were directly involved in building the physical architecture of the brain during early development. Specifically, the structures involved in coordinating movement and communication between the brain's left and right hemispheres. One gene in particular stood out, a gene called MAP2, which plays a critical role in organizing microtubules, the tiny protein tubes that give brain cells their shape and help transport materials inside them during the earliest stages of brain development, long before a baby is even born. Variations in this gene were strongly linked to left-handedness, and remarkably, they were also linked to differences in the brain's white matter, the bundles of nerve fibers that connect the left and right hemispheres and allow them to communicate. This gave scientists their first real clue about what might actually be different inside a left-handed brain. It was not that the brain was somehow broken or miswired. It was that certain genes involved in building the connective architecture between the two hemispheres were, on average, organized in a slightly different pattern. A separate line of research had already been building toward a similar conclusion for years. Long before this large-scale genetic study, researchers had identified a gene called PCSK6, involved in an early stage of embryonic development called left-right asymmetry, the process by which a developing embryo determines which side of the body will become the left side and which will become the right, a process responsible not just for handedness, but for making sure organs like the heart end up positioned correctly inside the body. This was a striking discovery because it linked handedness to one of the most fundamental processes in early human development, the same biological system responsible for deciding where your heart, your liver, and your other internal organs are positioned before you are even born. Left-handedness, in other words, is not some minor cosmetic quirk sitting off to the side of human biology. It is connected to one of the deepest, earliest decisions your body makes about its own structure in the first few weeks after conception. Around the same time, researchers studying another gene called LRRTM1 found a variation strongly associated with left-handedness that also appeared to be involved in brain lateralization, the process by which certain functions, like language, become more concentrated in one hemisphere of the brain than the other. In most right-handed people, language processing is heavily concentrated in the brain's left hemisphere. In left-handed people, this pattern is noticeably more varied. Some left-handed individuals still process language primarily in the left hemisphere, similar to right-handed people. Others process it more on the right side, and a significant number show a more balanced pattern, with both hemispheres contributing more evenly. This variability turns out to matter for far more than which hand someone writes with, because the same brain networks involved in language and hand coordination are also deeply connected to networks involved in creativity, spatial reasoning, and even certain aspects of emotional processing. Some researchers have proposed that the more varied hemispheric organization seen in many left-handed brains could help explain a pattern that keeps showing up in psychological research. A modest but real overrepresentation of left-handed individuals in fields that require unusually flexible divergent thinking, such as music, visual art, and architecture. It is important to be careful here, because this is one of the most exaggerated claims about left-handedness in popular culture. So let's be precise about what the actual research shows. The scientific evidence does not suggest left-handed people are simply smarter or more creative than right-handed people as a rule. Large-scale studies on general intelligence show no meaningful average difference between left-handed and right-handed populations. What the evidence does suggest is something more specific and, in some ways, more interesting. A genuinely wider range of brain organization patterns within the left-handed population as a group, more variability in how language, spatial processing, and motor control are distributed between the two hemispheres, compared to the noticeably more uniform pattern typically seen in right-handed brains. Now here is where the story gets genuinely puzzling, because even with all of this genetic evidence, there is something strange sitting right at the center of it. When researchers add up the effect of every single genetic variant identified so far linked to handedness, all of them combined only explain a small fraction, roughly around 25%, of why a specific individual ends up left-handed or right-handed. That leaves the majority of the story unexplained by known genes alone. This does not mean handedness is not genetic. The twin studies make clear that it is. What it means is that handedness appears to be what geneticists call a highly polygenic trait, shaped by the combined cumulative effect of hundreds, possibly thousands of tiny genetic variants scattered across the genome, each contributing only a minuscule nudge on its own, plus a real but still not fully understood contribution from the environment during early development in the womb. This is actually a pattern scientists see again and again with some of the most fundamental human traits, things like height or general intelligence. Just like handedness, these traits are strongly heritable according to twin studies, yet no single gene, or even a handful of genes, can fully explain them. They emerge instead from an enormously complex genetic orchestra, with thousands of tiny instruments all playing at once, and left-handedness now appears to belong firmly in that same category of deeply but diffusely genetic traits. Let's turn now to the question that opened this video. Why has left-handedness survived at a remarkably stable rate of around 10% for tens of thousands of years, despite centuries of social pressure, punishment, and even outright violence directed at left-handed people throughout history? From a pure evolutionary standpoint, this persistence is genuinely strange, and scientists have proposed several competing theories to explain it. The most well-known explanation is sometimes called the fighting hypothesis. first proposed by researchers studying the unusually high rate of left-handedness found in certain competitive combat sports, including fencing, boxing, and mixed martial arts, where left-handed athletes are consistently overrepresented among top competitors, often making up 20% or more of elite fighters in some disciplines, roughly double their share of the general population. The theory suggests that in a world where the overwhelming majority of people are right-handed, a left-handed fighter holds a genuine tactical advantage, because opponents have far less experience predicting and defending against attacks coming from an unfamiliar angle. Researchers studying this pattern in anthropological data found something that strengthens the theory considerably. Human societies with historically higher rates of interpersonal violence and warfare tend to show a slightly higher proportion of left-handed individuals compared to more peaceful societies, a correlation that shows up across a range of traditional and historical populations studied by anthropologists. The theory suggests a kind of evolutionary balancing act, sometimes called negative frequency dependent selection. As long as left-handed individuals remain a minority, they retain a meaningful surprise advantage in physical confrontation. If left-handedness ever became too common, that advantage would disappear entirely, because opponents would simply become accustomed to facing left-handed fighters. This dynamic, some researchers argue, could help explain why the trait has settled at a stable minority percentage across nearly every human population studied, rather than disappearing completely or spreading to become the majority. A related theory focuses less on combat and more on cooperation. Because humans are an intensely social and cooperative species, some researchers argue that 10% equilibrium reflects a balance between two competing evolutionary pressures. Being part of the right-handed majority carries real practical advantages in a world built almost entirely around right-handed tools, right-handed instruments, and right-handed social coordination, from shaking hands to passing objects to operating shared machinery. But being part of a small, left-handed minority carries its own, more specific advantages in situations involving direct physical competition. According to this theory, evolution never fully resolved this tension in either direction. It simply settled into a stable equilibrium, keeping left-handedness a persistent minority trait, generation after generation, neither disappearing nor spreading to dominance. There is also a historical layer to this story that has nothing to do with genetics directly, but has everything to do with why left-handedness became so heavily stigmatized in the first place, and why so many people who were naturally left-handed throughout history were forced, often through outright punishment, to write and work with their right hand instead, a practice that was still common in many schools well into the 20th century. Across dozens of unrelated cultures and languages, spanning thousands of years in completely different parts of the world, left has been consistently associated with everything considered wrong, unlucky, or evil, while right has been associated with correctness, morality, and skill. In Latin, the word for left is sinister, a word that eventually gave English the modern meaning of something ominous or threatening. In French, the word for left, gauche, became an English word meaning clumsy or socially awkward. In many older English texts, the word right itself carried the double meaning of correct and morally proper, a linguistic pattern repeated across numerous unrelated language families around the world. Researchers who study the origin of this bias point to a combination of practical and religious factors. In a world where the overwhelming majority of people were right-handed, and before modern hygiene practices existed, many traditional cultures developed strict customs reserving the left hand for unclean tasks, and the right hand for eating and greeting others, simply because most people's dominant hand was already the right one. Over time, these practical customs hardened into moral and religious associations that had very little to do with practicality anymore, and left-handed individuals, a genetic minority through no choice of their own, ended up bearing the weight of an association they had no part in creating. This bias was not just cultural background noise. It had direct measurable consequences on real people for centuries. Historical records from schools across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia document widespread practices of forcibly retraining naturally left-handed children to write with their right hand, sometimes through fairly severe punishment, well into the middle of the 20th century. Some researchers who study this period believe this forced retraining may have artificially suppressed the recorded rate of left-handedness in official statistics for decades, meaning the true underlying genetic rate of left-handedness may always have been slightly higher than official records showed, with a portion of naturally left-handed individuals simply forced to function as right-handed for their entire lives, and even reporting themselves as right-handed on surveys, despite their natural inclination. It was not until attitudes began shifting significantly in the second half of the 20th century that this forced retraining largely stopped in most parts of the world, and recorded rates of left-handedness in newer generations began rising slightly and then stabilizing at the roughly 10% figure researchers see consistently in genetic and population studies today. This shift itself became an unplanned real-world natural experiment. one that gave researchers a rare opportunity to compare handedness rates before and after cultural suppression eased, and the results lined up closely with what the genetics would predict once social pressure was removed from the equation. Now let's bring this back to the brain itself, because there is one more piece of this puzzle that researchers only connected fairly recently, and it involves a small but consistent pattern found in certain neurological and developmental conditions. Several studies have found a slightly higher rate of left-handedness among individuals with certain conditions related to atypical brain development, including some studies pointing to modestly elevated rates among people with dyslexia, stuttering, and among children later diagnosed with certain attention-related conditions compared to the general population. It is critical to be precise about what this finding actually means, because it has been badly misrepresented in popular media for decades. This does not mean being left-handed causes any of these conditions, and the overwhelming majority of left-handed people show no elevated risk for any of them at all. What researchers believe is happening instead is that both left-handedness and the specific conditions can, in some cases, trace back to shared underlying factors in how the brain organizes itself during a critical window of early development, particularly involving that same process of hemispheric lateralization. We discussed earlier the process that determines how strongly certain functions, like language, become concentrated in one side of the brain versus distributed more evenly across both. In most people, this lateralization process follows a fairly predictable, standardized pattern. In a meaningful subset of left-handed individuals, this same developmental process appears to unfold along a wider range of possible patterns. Most of the time, this simply results in the harmless, ordinary variation of being left-handed instead of right-handed, with no other consequences at all. In a smaller subset of cases, when the same developmental variability intersects with other genetic or environmental factors during early brain development, it may very slightly increase the likelihood of certain neurodevelopmental differences as well. The relationship, in other words, is not causal in either direction. It is correlational, and it points back to a shared developmental root, not a simple cause and effect chain running from one trait directly to the other. The same underlying variability is also what some researchers believe connects left-handedness to the modest but consistently observed overrepresentation of left-handed individuals in certain creative and artistic fields, a pattern documented across multiple studies looking at musicians, visual artists, and architects. The proposed explanation is not that left-handed brains are simply better at creative thinking in some general sense. It is that a wider range of hemispheric organization may, in some individuals, support more flexible connections between brain regions that do not typically communicate as directly in a more standardized right-handed brain, potentially supporting certain kinds of divergent associative thinking that benefit specific creative and artistic tasks. There is one more genetic wrinkle worth mentioning before we bring this all together, because it complicates the picture in a way that researchers still have not fully resolved. Left-handedness does not appear to follow simple, predictable inheritance patterns the way something like eye color does. Two right-handed parents can, and regularly do, have left-handed children. Two left-handed parents are statistically more likely to have a left-handed child than the general population average, but the majority of children born to two left-handed parents still turn out to be right-handed. This kind of inheritance pattern, where a trait clearly runs in families without following a clean, predictable ratio, is exactly what you would expect from a highly polygenic trait shaped by dozens or hundreds of genetic variants working together, rather than a single dominant or recessive gene controlling the outcome on its own. Researchers have also looked closely at identical twins specifically, because they offer one of the clearest natural experiments available in human genetics. Even though identical twins share essentially the same DNA, roughly 20% of identical twin pairs are what researchers call handedness discordant, meaning one twin is left-handed and the other is right-handed, despite growing up with nearly identical genetics and, in most cases, a very similar environment. This finding is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that something beyond genetics alone, some random or environmental factor occurring very early in prenatal development, plays a meaningful role in determining final handedness, even when the genetic blueprint is essentially identical between two individuals. Some researchers believe this randomness may trace back to very early events in the womb, potentially connected to the same left-right asymmetry process responsible for organ placement that we discussed earlier with the PCSK6 gene. Small, essentially random variations in how that early asymmetry process unfolds, sometimes described as a kind of biological coin flip layered on top of a genetic predisposition, could help explain why even genetically identical individuals do not always end up with the same hand dominance. This would mean handedness is not purely determined by genetics, and not purely determined by environment either, but by a genuinely probabilistic interaction between the two, with genetics loading the dice heavily in one direction or another, without ever fully guaranteeing the outcome. Historical and biographical records add one more interesting layer to this story. Because left-handedness shows up at notably higher rates among certain groups of high achievers throughout history than the general population's 10% baseline would predict, based on documentation from historians and biographers studying figures across science, politics, and the arts over the centuries. Whether this reflects a genuine cognitive advantage in specific domains, the wider hemispheric variability we discussed earlier expressing itself in unusually flexible thinking, or simply the fact that left-handed individuals throughout history who overcame significant social and practical disadvantages in a right-handed world may have needed to develop unusual persistence and adaptability to succeed in the first place, remains an open and actively debated question among researchers who study this pattern. What is not in question anymore, after more than a decade of genetic research building on those early twin studies, is that left-handedness is real, measurable, biological, and deeply woven into some of the earliest and most fundamental processes of human brain development, not a random quirk, not a bad habit, and certainly not the sign of moral failing that so many cultures wrongly treated it as for thousands of years. It is worth noting that researchers have also looked at whether left-handedness differs by sex, and the data shows a small but consistent pattern here as well. Across large population studies, men are slightly more likely to be left-handed than women, typically by a few percentage points, a gap that has shown up consistently across many different countries and cultures. Some researchers believe this may connect to subtle differences in average patterns of brain lateralization between males and females that show up in other areas of neuroscience research as well, though this remains an active area of study rather than a settled conclusion, and the difference is small enough that it explains only a modest part of the overall picture. This connects to one final practical implication of all this research, one that goes beyond pure science and into everyday life. Understanding that left-handedness stems from real, measurable differences in early brain architecture, rather than being a habit or a preference that could simply be trained away, is part of why the old practice of forcing left-handed children to switch hands is now considered outdated, and, according to some researchers who have studied its effects, potentially harmful, since it forces a child's brain to override wiring that was established before birth, rather than working with the brain's natural organization. Modern educators and pediatric specialists now generally recommend allowing children to use whichever hand feels natural, adapting tools like scissors, pens, and desks to fit the child, rather than the other way around. So let's return to the question we opened with. Why has left-handedness survived at a remarkably stable rate of around 10% through tens of thousands of years of human history, despite centuries of punishment, superstition, and outright social pressure designed to erase it? The answer scientists have pieced together over the last decade is not a single gene and not a single explanation. It is a combination of dozens, possibly hundreds of genetic variants working together to shape the brain's earliest architecture, layered on top of an evolutionary balancing act that has kept this trait locked in a stable, minority equilibrium for as long as humans have existed, further complicated by a genuine element of biological randomness occurring in the earliest days of prenatal development, one that means even genetically identical twins do not always end up sharing the same hand. It took modern genome sequencing technology, databases containing DNA from hundreds of thousands of people, and more than a decade of dedicated research to finally connect these pieces together. The 2019 Oxford study identifying specific genetic regions linked to brain architecture. The earlier discovery of PCSK6 and its connection to the earliest asymmetry decisions a developing embryo makes. The twin studies revealing just how much of the story genetics alone still cannot explain. Each discovery added another layer to a picture that is still, even now, not completely finished. And the most remarkable part of this entire story might be what it reveals about the human brain more broadly, not just for the roughly 10% of people who are left-handed, but for everyone. It shows that something as seemingly simple as which hand you naturally reach for a pen with is actually the visible tip of an extraordinarily complex developmental process, one shaped by genetics, by chance, and by the earliest, most fundamental decisions your brain makes about its own structure before you are even born. Left-handedness, in other words, is not a deviation from how the brain is supposed to work. It is one of the clearest, most visible reminders that there was never really just one single correct way for a human brain to be built in the first place. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening inside a left-handed brain, make sure to subscribe, because next week we are breaking down another genetic mystery that scientists only recently learned to explain, and it might surprise you even more than this one did. And if you are left-handed, or someone in your family is, I want to know, drop a comment and tell us if anyone else in your family shares the trait, and whether you ever experienced any pressure growing up to switch hands. Scientists are still uncovering new pieces of this puzzle every year, and the next major discovery about the left-handed brain could be just around the corner. Thanks so much for watching this all the way through, and I will see you in the next video very soon.